Hello, my name's Dave Mann. I'd like to tell you about my late Nan, Alice Langstone. She was one of the kindest, gentlest, most nurturing women I've ever met. I'm biased, of course, but you wouldn't find anyone who knew her who would disagree. These attributes are even more amazing when you consider her family background and childhood. Nan never spoke about her early life with any sort of bitterness. Yet her life was definitely split into two very distinct parts, the one before she met my granddad and the other after she met him. Alice was born on the 8th of September 1914 at number 1 Briggs Street in the Nottinghamshire industrial town of Sutton-in-Ashfield. She was born into a world of discord. Britain had declared war on Germany just a few weeks earlier, and vast swathes of men were volunteering to serve in the forces. Some believed the war would be over by Christmas, others, who would sadly be proven right, were more sceptical. Children were left without older brothers and fathers, wives without their husbands. For Alice, there was no family to be disrupted in this way, and it seemed her early life had been preordained whether war had broken out or not. She was born illegitimately to Florence Harlow, a 22-year-old hosiery factory hand. The father was 21-year-old Michael Patrick Flynn. Although Michael wasn't named on the birth certificate, Alice was given the middle name of Flynn. We don't know Alice's early living arrangements for sure, but the indications are that she lived with Florence. What we do know is that when Alice was just a few weeks old, Florence was married to William Allen, a coal miner. Florence married William on the 30th of November 1914 at St Michael's and All Angels on Outram Street in Sutton-in-Ashfield. Outram Street was coincidentally where Alice's father, Michael Patrick Flynn, had been born on the 9th of February 1893. This photograph from the turn of the 20th century shows a tram belonging to the Mansfield and District Light Railways Company. Florence had been born on the 29th of December 1891 in Castle Gresley, just over the Nottinghamshire-Derbyshire border. I think in order to help everyone understand more about Alice's early life, I need to describe the background of her parents. Michael Patrick Flynn was the eldest son of John Flynn, a coal miner and former soldier of Irish descent, and his wife Eliza Jane Pride, sometimes known as Eliza Ann. Michael's siblings were Kate Pride, born illegitimately in 1890, just before her parents married, Margaret, born in 1899, Rosie, born in 1901, Bartholomew, born in 1904, and Samuel, born in 1906. John was known in the family for his drinking, and was thrown out a number of times by Eliza, his formidable wife. We know this from conversations I had with Alice. Alice didn't express any regret about her background, and quite openly and honestly talked about it with me on a number of occasions. Alice believed that John was last seen by his family around 1915, when John's daughter Rosie, a precocious teenager, told him to go away and never come back. He was never thought to have returned. I have traced a possible death for John in 1920 in Whitehaven, in the old county of Cumberland, not far from where his own sister Ellen lived. John came from a typically sized family of the time, particularly for a practising Catholic family. His siblings were Michael, Mary Ann, Ellen, Margaret, Bridget, Annie and Bartholomew. Both John and Margaret were born in County Galway in pre-famine Ireland before moving to England and marrying in a Catholic chapel in Manchester. A glimpse into John Flynn's family can also be seen in local papers of the time. John was born in 1858 and bred in Chesterfield, Derbyshire, where his Irish immigrant parents had settled. There were a number of newspaper articles describing loud, violent exchanges between his two sisters, Mary Ann and Margaret. Such is the background from which Michael, Alice's father, grew up. In any event, Eliza Jane Flynn, Michael's mother, decided to remarry at the age of 49 to another coal miner, Ellis Radford, in 1916. At the marriage, she described herself as a widow. Either she knew John had died, in which case the death I found in 1920 is the wrong John Flynn, or she considered him dead to her and wanted to move on with her life. The marriage to Ellis was short-lived. Eliza Jane was widowed when Ellis died in 1919, aged just 44. She was to remain Eliza Jane Radford until her own death at the age of 80 in 1948. Eliza Jane Pride, Michael's mother, was born in 1867 in Sutton in Ashfield to George and Rosanna Pride. George himself was illegitimate, although his parents did later marry. George and Rosanna had 9 known children, although there may have been more. Eliza's siblings were Samuel, George, Charles, Frederick, Alice, Alfred, Kate and Wilfred. All of her surviving brothers seem to have been colourful characters. Samuel, pictured here in military uniform, the eldest, appeared in the Nottinghamshire Guardian when he was just 7 years old. He and his little friend, Henry Marshall, had been seen stealing 2 shillings 6.5 pence from a local butcher, James Hepworth. At the age of 7, the magistrate may have put it down to childish hijinks, but it seems that George, Samuel and Eliza's father disagreed. The newspaper report recorded that Samuel had been chastised by his father to the point where he had bled in the face. In modern eyes, this should have landed George in prison. However, it was a different time, and George escaped a sentence, but received a stern warning from the magistrate that if he thrashed his son to that extent again, he'd find himself in the meshes of the law. George probably thought he was doing his son some good by hopefully frightening him from breaking the law again. However, it never worked. Samuel appeared in the newspapers again a few years later, when he was 19, having been caught damaging grass whilst in search of mushrooms. He was ordered to either pay £1, a huge amount of money at the time, or endure 14 days hard labour. That was Victorian justice for you. Beat your child and you get a warning, tread on some grass and get 2 weeks hard labour. The next brother down was George, who even Alice described as a gentleman of the road. That was my nan. She had a lovely way of putting things. George was well known to the newspapers as well. The earliest example I've found is one from 1886 when he was 17. He was fined for being drunk and disorderly. Things got more serious when in 1890 he and a friend, Hedley Bloom, were charged with stealing a garment from a Mrs. Fox, the landlady of the Newcastle Arms Inn in Sutton. They each received a month in prison, and a lesser charge of vagrancy against them was dropped. The latest example I found was a report from 1897, where George and his friend Hedley again beat up a police officer. A PC Green was in the process of arresting John Holland, a drunk who he saw assaulting another man in the marketplace in Sutton. George and Hedley decided to join in and beat up the policeman, George seemingly kicking him in the head when he'd fallen to the ground. George and Hedley were then pursued along Stockwell Gate, where they were caught. Another struggle ensued, and either George or Hedley tried to throttle PC Green. I can find no other record of George Pride Jr. in the newspapers, but we know that he died aged 57 in the Basford area in 1927. The next brother Charles died as an infant, and the next brother along, Frederick, seems to have been a clean living man. However, Frederick's life was by no means easy. His son, Frederick Jr., was killed in the South Normanton colliery disaster in 1937, just after his wife had had their first daughter. And Frederick Sr. took on the difficult task of identifying his son's body. Alice remembers Frederick Sr. racing whippets, and Frederick Jr., in the newspaper report describing the colliery disaster, was pictured with 2 whippets. The next brother was Alfred, who again died as an infant, and the youngest brother was Wilfred. We have a picture of Wilfred as a soldier, but it's clear that he had a misspent youth. He first appeared in the newspapers in 1904, when, as an 18-year-old, he was charged with throwing a stone at a Salvation Army drummer as a procession walked along Club Street. He was found guilty on the strength of 2 independent witness statements and fined 10 and 6, the cost of a replacement drum. In 1908, Wilfred was implicated in a much more serious case. A domestic servant, Eliza Ann Waller, had been accosted by Wilfrid and two friends, Charles and Edgar Wildsmith, at around 9 p.m. on a Saturday evening. They struck her down and dragged her into a hut, where they indecently assaulted her and kept her prisoner until midnight. She eventually broke free and ran back to her employer's house. One of the Wildsmiths was charged with indecent assault a short time after. Wilfrid was arrested on the following Monday, but protested his innocence. The case was adjourned for a week. In a follow-up report a week later, Wilfrid was acquitted, as there was no doubt over his innocence. Wilfrid also appeared in a 1926 newspaper report, and this story sounds much more like a man down on his luck. In December 1926, the year of the general strike, Wilfrid was caught stealing bacon, eggs, cheese, butter and a tin of tomatoes. Wilfrid was suitably contrite in court. He was of no fixed abode. In mitigation, Wilfrid said that he had had a drink of beer and was sorry he took them. The trial ended with the magistrate asking Wilfrid if he was drunk when he committed the crime. Wilfrid replied no, and the magistrate promptly replied, "Then you knew what you were doing. You'll go to prison for 21 days hard labour." Christmas 1926 would have been a bleak one for Wilfrid. However, it seemed his life was to improve. He married Jane Kerry in 1931 and died in 1950, aged 63. Hopefully, this illustrates the family background of Michael Patrick Flynn, Alice's father. Sadly, not many articles are ever found in newspapers reporting how good and respectable people are. Such articles are not particularly newsworthy. However, it does illustrate that Michael didn't come from a trouble-free, harmonious family background. We now turn to Alice's mother, Florence Harlow. Florence was the eldest daughter of William Harlow, a brickmaker and latterly an engine driver, and his wife Ada, formerly Wetton. She had an elder brother, George William, who died when he was 20 in 1910, and two younger sisters, Ivas and Annie. William and Ada had married in Whitwick, near Colville, in Leicestershire, in 1889, and George had been born there. Soon after, they moved to Castle Gresley, where Ada was brought up, where Florence was born in 1891. Ivas was also born in Castle Gresley in 1895, but by the time Annie, the youngest, arrived in 1899, the family had moved to Station Street in Rochester, Staffordshire. William was a brickyard labourer and brickmaker in Whitwick, and with the coming of the railways, Rochester had become an industrial hub. In the 1890s, Red Hill Bank Brickworks was established at Rochester, which obviously attracted William. It was situated next to the railway station, and by 1911, William seems to have abandoned the brickmaking industry and was describing himself as an engine driver. Rochester later became the international headquarters of the famous JCB company. Shortly after Florence's younger sister Annie was born, their mother Ada died after a 7-day bout of pneumonia. She was 28 years old. This left the 4 children without a mother, and their father, a 28-year-old widower, with 4 children to look after. What's obvious is that around 6 months after Ada passed away, Ada's younger sister Ivas became pregnant by William, and their son Thomas William was born in February 1901. 5 additional children were to follow: Herbert, Horace, Ada, Ernest and John. I am almost certain that William and Ivas never married, but they are recorded on the 1901 census, 18 months after Ada died, living as husband and wife. Ivas is described as Ivas Harlow, William's wife. If they had married, it would have been illegal at that time. The Deceased Wife's Sister Marriage Act only appeared in the statute books from 1907. What we'll never know, of course, is what Florence thought of her father's relationship with her aunt. In fact, Alice remembers her Aunt Ivas. That unusual name was a key piece of evidence in proving I'd found the right family, when I eventually found them. What she may not have realised is that Ivas did not die until 1966, some years after Alice was married and her children had at least reached teenage years. Ivas herself may have been a bit of a character. She appeared in the newspaper herself in 1939, having been accused with her housemate of stealing 2 ash stands from the Mutton Inn in South Normanton in Derbyshire. We also know that Ada, formerly Wetton's mother, Anne Woolley, was born illegitimately in 1850, even though her parents later married. Tragically though, Anne's father Robert Gladwin Woolley, a carpenter, died at the age of 27 when Anne was only 6 years old. Her mother remarried when Anne was just 11 to James Fletcher. Florence became pregnant with Alice around the beginning of 1914. Her father William died on the 28th of August 1914, just 11 days before Alice was born. The cause of death was locomotor ataxia, exactly the same condition which had killed William's own father, William Sr., at an early age. Locomotor ataxia is a disease of the nervous system which manifests itself in the sufferer's gait. William would have walked in a clumsy, jerky manner and would not have known where his arms and legs were without looking at them. The cause of this is seen as syphilis. As a point of interest, William Sr. was himself born illegitimately as James Chapman in 1845, later taking his mother's new husband, William Harlowe's surname and even first name as well, but that's another story. It was into this family background of illegitimacy, absent fathers and early deaths that Alice was born. It's worth noting at this point that her father, a young Michael Patrick Flynn, had been born into a Catholic family on his father's side. Illegitimacy was enough of a stigma in those days, but when coupled with the Catholic faith, Alice would not have been viewed kindly by some of her family. We all know today how unfair that is. After all, Alice had no control over when and to whom she was born. Alice remembered little of her early life with her mother. As we know, when Alice was a few weeks old, her mother married William Allen. We know that Michael by this time had joined the army and left the area. So Alice lived with her mother and stepfather. She remembered being known at school as Alice Allen, even though she was never adopted by William Allen. Adoption in England and Wales was not formalised until 1927. In 1916, Florence and William Allen had a boy, James William, another boy, Walter, in 1919, and finally Charles in early 1920. Young Charles died as an infant later the same year. 1920 would prove to be a devastating year for Alice. Alice had no fond memories of William Allen at all. She remembers he was violent towards her mother, and he had no time for her. The next documented record we have of Alice's whereabouts is her entry to the Mansfield Union cottage home, which was associated with Mansfield Union Workhouse at Stockwell Gate in Mansfield. She was admitted there on the 17th of June 1920. We don't know why she was admitted, but we do know that Florence died in the workhouse on the 7th of August 1920 of pulmonary tuberculosis, the same disease that killed her mother Ada 21 years previously. We can only apply conjecture to Florence and Alice's situation. We know that Florence's husband William had a child with another woman, an Elizabeth Mary Pennell, in 1921. So William and Elizabeth must have begun a relationship in at least September 1920, probably before. This means that when Florence and Alan were admitted to the workhouse, although we haven't yet found an admission record for Florence, William must have been having a relationship with Elizabeth. What we won't know is whether Florence had pulmonary tuberculosis before she was admitted to the workhouse. TB is often caused by coming into contact with other people with the disease, which seems likely in the workhouse, or poor nutrition, also likely in the workhouse. It seems reasonable to assume that William threw Florence and Alice out of the house, which left them at the mercy of the workhouse. Whilst in there, they would have been separated, Florence being put to work in the workhouse and Alice being admitted to the cottage home. Although neither Nan nor I knew what she meant, she remembers being in a big house with some other children and being allowed to do whatever she wanted. The sad thing is, I imagine her young mind would think of simply being allowed to walk around freely a complete joy compared to the oppressive atmosphere she was used to when living with William Allen. To illustrate more of the character of William Allen, he was quick also to give away his two surviving sons by Florence, James and Walter. James went to live with Florence's aunt, Emma Bromley, who had lost two infant sons very recently, and Walter was given to the Marshall family friends who lived in a yard near the Dewdrop Inn in Skegby, Nottinghamshire. Although we don't know what happened to Walter, we do know that James adopted the Bromley surname and lived this way until 1991, having had a family of his own. Alice is recorded as leaving the cottage home on the 28th of August 1920 3 weeks after her mother had died. It seems such a small amount of time to us adults, but those 3 weeks must have been the loneliest of her short life. No mother, no present father, and having no home other than the workhouse. Who then enabled Alice's release from the workhouse in those trying times? Step forward Eliza Jane Radford, formerly Flynn, née Pride, her natural father's mother. How Eliza Jane came to know of her granddaughter's predicament will now never be known. However, Alice did not return to the workhouse again, and we believe in Alice's formative years, the 1920s, were spent in her grandmother's care. You could be forgiven for wondering why Michael Patrick had not collected Alice himself. Let me describe the course of his life between Alice's birth and the 1920s. Michael had served with the Sherwood Foresters Regiment in the Great War, and on the 1st of January 1918 he had married Elsie Reeves or Rayner, a mother of one. They started a family almost immediately. Their eldest son, George, was born in the spring of 1918, and a daughter Elsie was born in 1920. Tragedy was soon to hit Michael's young family, as a local newspaper report of November 1920 shows. The report shows that Elsie had been doing her washing, and at the same time had placed a bathtub of hot water on the floor near the sofa. George, a typical, almost 2-year-old, had been playing in the street outside and ran into the house. He tried to climb up on the sofa, but fell backwards into the hot bathtub, scalding himself badly. Elsie, screaming for help, applied oil to George's skin in an effort to cool him down, and he was quickly taken to Mansfield Hospital. Tragically, it was too late to save him, and he died there. As tragic as this event was, the report also shows that George's father, Michael Patrick, was living in America at the time of the accident. This coincides with a story his younger brother Bartholomew used to tell, saying that Michael had gone away to America and come back very quickly with a lot of money. Bart said he always thought Michael had something to do with the IRA. What seems more likely is that Michael was away trying to earn some money for the family and returned quickly as his young son had died in a tragic accident. But this does explain Michael's whereabouts at the time Florence died, and Alice was left alone in the cottage home. For all we know, he could have sent word to his mother to collect Alice when he learned of Florence's fate. Michael and Elsie went on to have 5 more children, but lost one of them, a son John, at the age of 2. The other children were Michael Patrick Jr., Morris, Rose and Margaret. Alice soon became of working age, and by the time she was 15, her grandmother would have been expecting her to earn her keep. In 1929, Alice's aunt and Eliza Jane's daughter Margaret married Joseph Thompson in Solihull, a leafy suburb of Birmingham. Margaret and Joe had a fish and chip shop in Acox Green, and this kept them very busy. So it seemed the obvious choice when Margaret had a baby son, William, that Alice should move to Birmingham to help look after him while his parents ran the fish and chip business. Alice was remembered fondly by William Thompson, who went on to do extremely well, qualifying as a general practitioner, opening up his own medical practice in Liverpool, and also having several other business interests. However, as William grew up and needed less and less of Alice's time, she, as well as helping Margaret and Joe in the fish and chip shop, got a job as a barmaid, working at the Baldwin pub in nearby Hall Green. At some time in the late 1930s, Alice caught the eye of Jack Langstone, a handsome young police officer who also served as a reservist in the Scots Guards. They married at St John's Church, Spark Hill in Birmingham on New Year's Eve 1940. Sadly, no wedding photographs exist, as they were accidentally exposed to the light by Jack's cousin Evelyn's 12-year-old twin daughters, Hazel and Heather Smith. It was shortly before her wedding that Alice finally found out for definite who her natural father was. She knew Eliza Jane as Gran, and logic dictates that one of her 3 sons was her father, yet she never knew for sure who it was until Michael told her just before she got married. She remembered writing him a letter, obviously upset, saying, "Dear Dad, for the first and last time, goodbye." Jack went off to serve with the Scots Guards soon after, rising to the rank of Quartermaster Sergeant. Given the uncertainty of the war, like many young couples, they put off starting a family until the war was over. Consequently, their eldest child, Betty Ann, was born in 1946, Charles William, named after Jack's father, was born in 1949, and finally Margaret, named after Alice's aunt and who became my mum, was born in 1951. Her beloved Gran Eliza Jane died in Primrose Lane, Hall Green, in September 1948. Alice remembered her in her later years, often as wearing a hat, the brim of which she'd pulled down over one eye to hide a squint. I'd love to think that she was proud of Alice, proud of the wife and mother she'd become. Alice and Jack settled in the Shirley, Solihull area. It seems as though there was a desire on Alice and Michael's part to try and make an effort to build a relationship, presumably given the fact that Alice had 3 children who had no other grandparents. Jack's parents had died in 1949 and 1950, barely meeting Betty and Charlie, and not meeting Margaret at all. Michael was the only grandparent the children had, so it's possible this was behind the reconciliation attempt. One encounter was particularly uncomfortable. It was clear that Elsie, Michael's wife, didn't appreciate Alice's presence as a reminder of a part of her husband's life she wanted to forget. This was quite ironic, given the fact that she had already had an illegitimate son, Ernest, before she'd married Michael. Alice and Jack had gone to visit Michael for a 3-week holiday, probably at some point in the mid-1950s. Margaret remembers little other than sitting underneath the table, a child's way of escaping the difficult atmosphere and stilted conversation. They were meant to stay 3 weeks, but ended up staying for 3 days. It seems to have been Jack who finally decided enough was enough and brought his family home again. Elsie, Michael's wife, died in 1969, and it was after this point that Michael seems to have made more of an effort to be involved in Alice's life. He certainly sent a letter to Margaret, my mum, in response to her wedding invitation in September 1971, expressing regret that he couldn't attend, but wishing her all the best for the future. Margaret has a memory of Michael travelling to see them at the family home in Lawnswood Avenue in Shirley, albeit on just one occasion. By the later 1970s, Michael was getting older, and contact had dropped off again as far as I know. I remember growing up knowing that my nan had a dad alive somewhere, which I was fascinated by. To think my nan had a parent alive was quite amazing, and I was curious enough to want to meet him, but realistic enough to understand that it wasn't that simple for Nan. The 1970s, early 1980s was a time for their children marrying, and 5 grandchildren had been born between 1973 and 1980. Alice fussed over her brood endlessly. She always hated to hear conflict, crosswords or arguing. When you know about the upbringing she had, this is not surprising. Studies have shown that a child's values and outlook on life are set by the age of 8. Given Alice's experience by the time she turned 8, shunned by her contemporaries and most of her family, and also losing her mother in the workhouse, her stoic views on avoiding unpleasantness and the importance of family were all the more remarkable. I like to think we surrounded her with love as we were growing up. When I was old enough, I'd often walk the 5-minute journey to her flat and see how she was. In 1983, my wonderful granddad Jack passed away. Alice was absolutely devastated. He hadn't even had the chance to retire properly. After she lost Grandad, she threw herself into helping to look after us grandchildren, and as we got older, needing to find a purpose which benefited others, she took a voluntary job at the Oxfam charity shop, eventually being given the responsibility of deputy manager. She loved it, and for a long time she divided her time between the shop and her family. I would hate to think she ever felt alone with us around. What I find most tragic of all is that even in the later stages of life, despite her settled lifestyle, she couldn't completely escape her past. In 1992, aged almost 78, she received a letter from one of her Sutton in Ashfield family. The letter said that they were sorry to have to tell her that Michael, her father, had died 4 years previously in 1988. The reason given for her not being told sooner was that the Sutton family had lost her address. This wasn't a reasonable excuse at all. Her cousin William Thompson had regular contact with the Sutton family and could have passed this on. I remember Nan being very upset by this, but we'll never know how upset she really was, as I think she hid a lot of her emotions very well. She'd had a lot of practice when she was younger, I guess. We finally lost our beloved Nan on the 20th of May 1994. Most people who lose a grandparent are devastated, and we were no different. Her funeral was attended by a huge amount of people who had wanted to pay their respects. To think how she'd started out in life, who once she'd lost her mother had never really been an important part of anyone's life, and yet there was barely standing room at a funeral. Those people who overlooked her when she was a child and tried to forget she existed, well, let's just say it was their loss. She really was a truly inspirational lady, whose story we should all remember whenever we feel hard done by or despondent. Rest in peace, Nan.